Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Ryan Cooper.
And I'm Alexei the Greek. Very happy to welcome Matt Sitman from the wonderful Know Your Enemy podcast. I'm sure a lot of the listeners have heard of it. If you haven't, check it out. It's really wonderful. But also a great writer and editor. I first discovered you, Matt, back when The Daily Dish was the best blog on the internet, back when blogs were a thing. It was just, say what you will about Andrew Sullivan. That blog was just tremendous. I read it every day. And I remember to this day when you wrote about like Christopher Isherwood and Vedanta Hinduism, I'm like, yes, yes, this is awesome. Where else can you find this?
Yeah.
So that's when I first discovered your great writing and editing, and now you write and edit for great publications like Dissent Magazine, editor at Commonweal, and many other wonderful things. So please welcome and even tell us a bit more about the great work you're doing, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, very quickly, I'm associate editor at Commonweal, and we're a 95-year-old kind of liberal, progressive Catholic magazine. I recently joined the editorial board of Dissent, where I publish a few pieces a year there, and I really love Dissent too. And I'm the co-host of Know Your Enemy with my good friend Sam Edler-Bell. So I think those are the three main affiliations in my life: Commonweal, Dissent, and Know Your Enemy.
Nice. But as Pope Francis, the Holy Father, says in the encyclical we'll be talking about, you are much more than the sum of those parts. So,
right.
We really appreciate you in the fullness of your humanity and the dignity of your person being here to tell us about this wonderful, really powerful encyclical, I thought. Before we dive into it, because it's a really rich text with a lot we could cover, more than we could possibly cover in one episode. If you wouldn't mind kind of just introducing a little bit about, why encyclicals are something to pay attention to and what purpose they serve as far as you understand it.
Sure. Well, I think the main thing to understand about papal encyclicals is that they indicate a very high priority for the Pope. So if you want to understand, I think, a particular papacy, if you want to understand Pope Francis, look at his encyclicals. And one of his previous encyclicals was Laudato Si, on caring for our common home. And I think that was one of the most important documents put out by any world leader, let alone religious leader, in recent memory. And I think, as we'll discuss, when you see the content of this latest encyclical, Fratelli, Tutti, that's something that on social solidarity and kind of the brotherhood and sisterhood of all human beings and what we owe each other and how we can live together. I think that its themes indicate just how close this is to Francis's heart. So I think for a general audience, that's what I would say. Documents a Pope puts out, Pope Francis has put out a handful of them. I think maybe this is the third. And again, they just indicate that this is a high priority for him, that the themes we're about to discuss are really close to Francis's heart.
No, that's a great introduction. And I really was amazed stylistically about how not just scripturally based, but also how conversant in political theory the document is, but also in the most loving way possible, how it seems like a massive subtweet of Trump, white supremacy, and capitalism.
I know. That's really true. I would just say to emphasize something you noted, it's a really beautifully written document. Even though it's in translation, I find one of the pleasures of reading Francis's encyclicals, as well as some of his, occasional homilies and other statements, that he has a real gift for a simple but graceful poetic language. And there are just many phrases in this that are really beautiful and striking. And if any listeners are interested in reading it, it's actually just really lovely to read, actually.
It is beautiful.
Yeah, and I was rereading some of it this afternoon, and I was struck by the same thing you were, which is just how beautifully expressed it was. And as you mentioned, the themes of nationalism, populism, neoliberalism. I mean, it's interesting, right? Everyone says neoliberalism doesn't exist. And by everyone, I mean a certain kind of centrist pundit. And I was very pleased to see this in a papal document. So now I can say that the Holy Father himself has confirmed the existence of this phenomenon.
Yeah, it's funny. He didn't call out anyone in particular except Matt Iglesias for some reason. I don't know. It was weird. He actually does literally not named Twitter, but he's definitely referencing like Twitter wars, which was fascinating. But
yes.
You're right. Even the headings are beautiful, like dark clouds over a closed world. I just opened a random page here. Ancient conflicts thought long buried are breaking out anew, while instances of a myopic, extremist, resentful, and aggressive nationalism are on the rise.
Yes.
I mean, just succinct, beautiful, and he's just spot on, sentence after sentence.
Yes, totally. And I think, that language, maybe this is one interesting thing to begin with, which is I was so struck in this document by the language of dreaming. The dream, like that we need to dream again, that we've quit dreaming. And I was reminded that one of my old teachers in graduate school was the late political theorist Jean Bethke Elshtain. And she always liked to say in her seminars on American political thought that Dr. King said he had a dream and not a preference. That there's a certain moral imagination at work here that I think is really instructive to think about, that the way we talk about politics and how we live together, in the very language of the document itself, there's a critique of a certain arid, austere, liberal mindset.
Yeah, so it's beautiful and at the same time a kind of epistemological critique in that way, right?
Yes, totally. And I think, we live in an era of cynicism, and Francis talks a lot in the document just about kind of disappointment, and kind of putting people down and diminished expectations in the sense that we can't do new things. We can't move forward. We can't start again. And I just think the language of dreaming and hope really is and again, this is a favorite line of mine, but hope is not the same as optimism either. So I just think the very language itself captures something of that. And he's really calling us to, do big things and kind of, don't be afraid to be earnest and hopeful and really believe that a different world is possible.
Yeah. And so he's definitely critical of capitalism, or at least capitalism in the sense that it's practiced here, like in the 21st century United States and, across the world. But he's not critical of it in a necessarily social sense. He's, he talks about how it erodes, the sort of like the morality of individuals and their relationships with each other, which is sort of overlapping with like a kind of Marxist critique perhaps, but it's not, about exploitation per se. Like it's about like one's spiritual life and one's internal, thoughts and their and external behaviors towards our neighbors or brothers and sisters. So like maybe can you situate that like I know that the Catholic Church, I'm not Catholic, and my knowledge of the history of the Catholic Church is spotty at best, but as I recall, it's been fairly conservative for kind of hundreds of years, up until like somewhat recently in the 20th century. There's been some sort of like disputes about that. There's the Jesuits and the social gospel, whatever you call it, and like especially in Latin America, and so like how is what Francis is saying like kind of tied into what the church has been teaching for a long time about community and tradition and so on, and how is it sort of a break from like the more conservative Pope that came before him?
Sure. Well, I think one thing to understand about the kind of history you're referencing, especially in the last century or so, is that, the church did fear communism and communist regimes. And so I think for that reason, there was always a sense of, I don't want to say having it both ways, but sort of criticizing the excesses of capitalism, but not kind of giving an inch to communist regimes and communism. Godless materialist communism, you might say. And I think that, a pope like John Paul II, who was not the pope that preceded Francis, but the one before him, or the one before his predecessor. He was Polish, and so the Cold War was a major preoccupation of his, and the communist regimes were a major preoccupation of his. And that really stamped the church's, I think, approach to these questions. It wanted to rein in capitalism, but not seem like it was giving too much space to communism or even socialism. Now, I think what's interesting is that now that the Cold War is over, Francis is a pope that comes from Latin America. He's Argentinian, and during his time, he's really rehabilitated and kind of made liberation theology much more kind of accepted in a formal way in the church. And that's really important. But I also think you do see that, he doesn't talk about capitalism or socialism or communism. He doesn't really use those labels so much as he talks about technocrats and neoliberalism and globalization and kind of the effects on people, I think, as you pointed toward, but also the way forms of domination are justified by some of these paradigms, right? A technocratic paradigm, a paradigm of globalization. And he's really, and I think it might actually be more effective. He kind of lets the work of politics, this is not a document that lays out like an economic program.
Right.
And so I think he's kind of leaving open the work of politics, that those of us who read this document, or any citizen, right, who has a concern for the common good, can figure out in our own context kind of what moving forward in the way he suggests could mean. And that just means labels like socialism and capitalism aren't a major factor in this document, even if people like us might think that something like democratic socialism is, seems closer to some of what he's asking us to consider than the lack of that terminology in the document might lead you to think. But I also would say it's a very bottom-up document. He often says to start with the concrete and local and kind of move outward. And but on the other hand, he does talk about new global systems, revamping the United Nations to rein in global corporations and kind of their predations. And so it's not a very ideological document, even if its critiques of certain features of the modern economic order are incredibly damning and sharp.
Absolutely. And I found that he even specifically writes about the danger of terminology and language being used ideologically to the point where there's vacuity, where there's no meaning anymore to the term.
Yes.
And so you could understand that he does this for a reason, because he says, look how populism and populist is being used,
yes.
And how it's appropriated by demagogues. And look, even the words democracy and freedom have become hollow.
Yes.
And just kind of vague concepts that are uttered by politicians, rather than focusing, like you said, on the concrete, on the personal, on the interpersonal, on the communal. And so I find it to be a kind of a brilliant, imminent critique that is very savvy, right?
Yeah.
And very nuanced even in the way that it says, look, I understand patriotism can be a good thing, and loving your local, loving your country can be good. But then he does this brilliant move where he says, that's not the same thing as, essentially, he's calling out like the Trumpists and the white supremacists. That's not the same thing as something that's just fear of the other. And in fact, true appreciation for one's homeland invites hospitality and has to have an openness to others at its core.
Yes.
And so he's very brilliant in how he does that. And I do think that it would cash out to something like democratic socialism. But he lets you take your own conclusions.
Yeah, I think it might, to kind of borrow the cliche, he shows more than tells. And he describes more than he names. And one of the great themes of this encyclical is openness, opening our hearts, and then to some extent opening our minds. And so I think, there would be something contradictory, or at least there'd be a tension between calling for that and then, kind of relying on these ideological labels that he thinks have now been emptied of most content.
And I saw that he even revisited very familiar parables like the Good Samaritan in a really kind of brilliant exegetical way. And one that I think is a lot more materialist. He says even the Good Samaritan needed the nearby inn in order to complete, right? And I was thinking of this. I was reading...
And money.
Right, exactly. Liza Featherstone, I think, just published something in Jacobin about rural people who don't have hospitals nearby. And so helicopters have to take them to the hospital, and then they get hit with these massive helicopter fees because they happen to live in a place where there's nothing nearby, and they're taking the blame and responsibility and going into debt because of these structural, problems. And it seems like Francis is very clearly saying that's not an individual problem; that's a social and structural and political problem, right?
Yes, totally. And maybe just to frame this a little more, the document begins with a really clear-sighted overview of our situation. And one thing we haven't mentioned yet is the pandemic. And so he started this encyclical before the pandemic, and he kind of uses the pandemic to say that catastrophe has kind of laid bare all of the problems of modern society. We can kind of, the systems we live in have been exposed. Their weaknesses and frailties, and who those systems exclude and dominate has become even more apparent. The old, right? The poor. Those are, he really points to that. And, but then you're right. He kind of gives this overview that really is again, very clear-sighted and helpful. And then the next move is really this beautiful exegesis of the parable of the Good Samaritan. And in some ways, then the rest of the document is almost an elaboration of what it means to love your neighbor today.
Right.
Yeah, and the thing that I think I'd heard this before, but it was good to be reminded of it in the it was like a little sermon type of, a little biblical teaching element from in the text where he's talking about, good Samaritan, like the word Samaritan, like in modern sort of parlance, that like a good Samaritan is just like a nice person. It's like, oh, you're a good Samaritan. You stop to help somebody. But in the context back in them days, the Samaritans were a sort of like off branch of the like Jewish people, right? And they were hated. Like there was massive hostility between, the Israelites and the Samaritans. And so when Jesus is talking about, a priest and a Levite walking past this injured person, and then the Samaritan, it's like you have to sort of read some the contemporary cultural context and to get the full force of it, to say that like right. here are two godly men, a believer and then an actual religious authority, and they walked past, they left this suffering person by the side of the road. Here comes this outsider, someone who is a member of a different a group of people that we have like hostility. We're at daggers drawn with these guys, but then this guy's he sees him and he picks him up and puts him on his donkey and takes him to the inn and pays for his room and says tells the innkeeper, I'll pay for whatever this guy needs, just because he's a good person. And in fact, Francis has a line in there about how unbelievers, paradoxically, those who claim to be unbelievers, that's an interesting phrase, can sometimes put God's will into practice better than believers.
Yes.
And I thought that was like an interesting, like, I'm sure, if you've been to a lot of Sunday school and stuff, that's all very familiar. But like, that's an increasingly rare experience in modern America, I think it's fair to say. And, like the story, like it really hits when the whole, like the history and the context of it.
Yes.
And, it makes for a pretty good sort of encapsulation of what, what it should be like to live in a community.
Yes. No, I can't really improve on that description, but you're right that the Samaritans were considered for the Jewish people to be almost subhuman, right? So it's so telling that it's the Samaritan who actually does what is pleasing in the sight of God. And I think, there's a lot we can talk about with this document, but even just that the theme of kind of openness to others, interreligious dialogue, there's a lot of rich comments there that kind of really take to task religious hypocrites and those who use religion to exclude and dominate rather than care for the other. But I kind of wanted to just read from that section on the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I think this is a really interesting question, or it gets to something interesting. He says, the parable clearly does not indulge in abstract moralizing, nor is its message merely social and ethical, though it is that. He says it speaks to us of an essential and often forgotten aspect of our common humanity. We were created for a fulfillment that can only be found in love. We cannot be indifferent to suffering. We cannot allow anyone to go through life as an outcast. Instead, we should feel indignant, challenged to emerge from our comfortable isolation and to be changed by our contact with human suffering. That is the meaning of dignity. And it's just there are passages like that where he talks about tending to the wounds of others. And, I would just say that it's very easy to read this correctly as a critique of nationalism, racial and religious discrimination, a certain kind of populism, technocracy, and a certain kind of globalization. But he also, I do think there's a way in which those of us who might think that our political views mean we're better, or we don't have these nasty views. We're not retrograde right wingers. I think that challenge to enter into the suffering of others, and to tend to the particulars of people's lives in a way that I think sort of pushes, again, as I was saying previously, pushes against ideology in a way. I found that very, very telling, and I think it's just a call to. It's just a call to realize that holding the right ideas is not enough. And there's a real conversion of heart towards those who are suffering, those who are poor, those who are outcast. And just to that end, I think one of the really striking things about that jumped out at me in this exegesis of the parable of the Good Samaritan is he emphasizes that those who pass by the man who had been robbed and beaten on the side of the road, he says that these people were holding important social positions, but lacked in real concern for the common good. And then he said they would not waste a couple of minutes caring for the injured man, or even calling in help. And he goes on to then say, the Good Samaritan gave him something, meaning the man on the side of the road. He gave him something that in our frenetic world we cling to tightly. He gave his time. He said certainly he had his own plans for that day, his own needs, commitments, and desires, yet he was able to put all that aside when confronted with someone in need. Without even knowing the injured man, he saw him as deserving of his time and attention.
Yeah.
It's brilliantly accessible to everyone, right? I mean, who can't relate to that question of, do I take time away from my plans and my busy day to attend to something that is of no benefit to me, to a person I perhaps don't know, that diverts me from my control of my life, and just give time and attention to someone in need?
And I would say that this kind of gets at something I alluded to earlier, which is that I'm very struck by the way there's this almost toggling between, or moving back and forth between, the concrete and bigger political problems. And, moving from the care the Samaritan showed for the man on the side of the road, then to questions of how we organize society politically and economically. And I think he's almost telling us that if you don't tend to the particular, that's how you slip into ideology. That's how somehow even sometimes noble political aspirations turn into abstractions that manage to dominate and exclude. And so that's why I mentioned why I thought it even had something to say to people on the left. It shouldn't just be something where we say, oh, great, the Pope has enlisted himself in our cause against capitalism, right? It's actually
Right.
it's actually calling us to a sort of personal conversion, and I don't necessarily mean that in a religious conversion sense, like adopting a certain faith. I mean that in the sense of having our hearts stirred by the poor and the suffering, the weak and the wounded, and that there's this relationship between how we tend to the particular people suffering right in front of us and the big ideas we have about politics and economics and society.
Yeah, he writes that we all have the interior struggle, and that each of us has something of the wounded man, something of the robber, something of the passerby, something of the good Samaritan. And so it's kind of, at the same time, he shows these kind of examples that we might identify with Trump or even the Democrats or people that maybe represent the problem. But also all of us have all of these things, and to which things, which parts of us do we activate? I think it's it's a beautiful way to.
And I think especially for a certain, well, I was going to say certain kind of liberal or progressive, but it really applies to all of us. There's a phrase he uses where he says sometimes the peripheries are actually very close to us. In the way so many forms of suffering are hidden in modern society. So, that even people who live a neighborhood over, that's not what we think of when we think of the disaster on the border, right? And what we're doing, our government is doing to children on the border, or we think about a drought in Africa, or we think of, just far-flung examples of human suffering. And he's really saying there's so much suffering much closer to you than you realize. And that lack of attention to that is a form of, that distorts our understanding of things too.
Yeah, that to return to what you said, Alexi, I think the segment the paragraph that got me the hardest was when he turned away from like the sort of reinterpreted the parable to be like about the internal conflict within every person. Not to say that like the priest, the Levite, the robber, the injured person, and the Samaritan are all different, but that each person has that within themselves to some degree or another. Mm-hmm. And he says, which of these persons do you identify with? This question, blunt as it is direct and incisive. Which of these characters do you resemble? We need to acknowledge that we are constantly tempted to ignore others, especially the weak. Let us admit that, for all the progress we have made, we are still illiterate when it comes to accompanying, caring for, and supporting the most frail and vulnerable members of our developed societies. We've become accustomed to looking the other way, passing by, ignoring situations until they affect us directly.
Yes.
And it's like, yep, I have 100% stepped over a homeless person because my wallet was in the wrong pocket or whatever. Like, we've all done it, and I think like my response to that is like, okay, yeah, on the one hand, like here's a problem that can really only be solved permanently with politics, with the welfare state and other, social systems that would catch everyone. But on the other hand, that doesn't excuse me from not doing what would have been costless to me in that moment to take out a $5 bill and give it to someone. My beer budget is down by 0.5% for the month or whatever. Like I could have done it and I didn't, and that was wrong. And yet, it's like that's a thing we all do, and we all of us, unless we're saints, like we got to work on that. And I think that it's like, fuck.
Yeah. No, it's again, for all the obvious kind of targets of criticism that you see when you read this, I think it's a document that every person who reads it should feel in a way condemned by, And I just, again, want to emphasize how that move between, what we do as individuals, because on the other hand, Ryan, Pope Francis would say, Ryan, you should have given that guy $5. It doesn't matter if your beer budget is slightly reduced, but he also says that kind of private charity or personal kindness is not an excuse to forsake the big systemic change that needs to happen.
Right.
Yeah.
And so he's
Absolutely.
always, so when I say he's moving back and forth between those things and sees them actually as interrelated, that's partly what I mean. It's you might think it, on the one hand, he, is criticizing, a certain like ideological approach to things and saying, oh, well, no system can solve every problem. That's not exactly what he's saying. That might be true in a formal sense, but he's saying that the two go hand in hand, that your personal charity and your personal kindness actually helps us see what we need to do at a broader level. And it almost moves from that concrete and local outward. And the form of the encyclical itself takes that form, right? It moves from a parable in the New Testament about the Good Samaritan to then sweeping statements about, again, needing to reform the UN, needing to rein in the financialization of the economy and multinational corporations. And the relationship between those two things is partly what stood out to me in this document. And it's, but it is very, Francis is a pastor, and I hate to kind of contrast a pastoral approach with a more sophisticated theological approach. That's not what I'm saying, but just again, for listeners who might not have read it, I'm struck by the amount of criticism he gives to online relationships, right? And
I was just about to bring that up.
Yeah, and the way that what I mentioned with the Good Samaritan who gave of his time, he says there's no real substitute for really face-to-face friendships and spending time with people and intimately getting to know their suffering and pain. And he makes that great distinction between neighbors and associates, which I really like.
Yes, it's brilliant.
But just, that there's a way in which we can arrange our online lives so that we're mainly talking to people who agree with us. And rather than sort of, I don't want to say the randomness, but the diversity of people that if you're involved in your neighborhood or your community in some way you come across, there's one form of exclusion is through digital relationships that mean you're really only talking to people who basically agree with you or share certain views with you or whatever. And so there's these wonderful, just practical, very earthy examples of just spending time with people and loving particular people in all their complexity and messiness and fuck ups with, and kind of in contrast to the carefully curated relationships
where you
we
can
have
just
online.
unfriend somebody, right?
Yes.
Where you can just, avoid conflict, because he says that time is for interactions, but also he uses the word encounter a lot. And I think the suggestion is you can't really have true encounters online, right? You need to have the messiness of real life, the messiness of face-to-face, and the kind of slow complexity of developing real relationships in that way. And I want to come back to the important thing you're pointing out about this. I would call it like an isomorphism between the personal and the structural. It reminds me of Plato's Republic, where very consciously, Plato says, okay, to understand the human soul and the disharmony and the conflict in the human soul and how to have it harmonized and peaceful and happy, you need to blow it up and look at the city. And it's really a kind of an examination of both at the same time. Because what is a city? If Romney says that corporations are people, guess what? Cities are people, right? Like a polis is made of people. And so there's a sense in which Trump is a symptom, right? It's a spirit of a regime he's representing. And that is, of course, not just producing the kind of subjects that we have, which he does do, but also it's reflecting what was already there. And there is this concern, as Ryan said, for the spiritual and the interior. But he points out that subject formation is shaped by these political, economic, like larger forces. And so of course people are acting like this. Of course people are doing these things. If that's the kind of structural incentives and requirements that they have to adhere to survive.
Yes,
right?
Totally. That actually comparison to Plato's Republic is, I hadn't thought of it, but now I won't derail us by pausing to ponder that, but I think it's very apt, and when we're done, I will spend some time this evening thinking about that. But, yeah,
Awesome.
Yeah, and to return to the question of the sort of fake digital community, I thought that was kind of interesting. He says, quote, Digital relationships which do not demand the slow and gradual cultivation of friendships, stable interaction, or the building of a consensus that matures over time have the appearance of sociability. Yet they do not really build community. Instead, they tend to disguise and expand the very individualism that finds expression in xenophobia and in contempt for the vulnerable. Digital connectivity is not enough to build bridges. It's not capable of uniting humanity. And this was a thing where, like, I have a little quibble about this, I think, because on one level, he was definitely correct. Like there are people, people who I consider friends who like have just like written off completely because of a totally ridiculous spat over shit that nobody cares about on online, on Twitter or elsewhere. And yet, I think that like there is a connection there.
Yes.
And I think also the connection, like it's not, maybe it's not enough to build bridges, but it's enough to start building a bridge, that one might finish in the form of actual face-to-face communication. And also that, like the kind of structure of like digital institutions doesn't get a lot of attention in here, but I think that the way that the sort of like how the structure of a marketplace has a very great effect on how the market works.
Yes.
But the rules of the game are the structure of a digital institution matters a great deal. Like the days of forums and blogs was very different, and I would say more wholesome socially than the days of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And that, not coincidentally, is a sort of like more dispersed ownership versus sort of monopoly capitalism run by like ruthless digital robber barons.
Yes.
But I don't think it's too hard to sort of integrate those two things into what sort of Pope Francis is driving at here in terms of like, we have, digital communication. I feel like he's got a little bit of a cranky, like kids these days on their Twitter phones and stuff. So they don't sit down at the cafe and talk about, the Gospels anymore.
Yeah.
But, I think you like, there's some, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. There's something valuable in there that isn't, that could be brought back and not just say like, everything's going to be Facebook and sort of like a fascism propaganda machine, right?
Yeah.
Really, Ryan is just really grateful because Ryan and I met through Twitter and we're best buddies. And, so without Twitter, Ryan and I would not be friends. And there you go.
Right. No. We did meet in person, though, later.
Yeah.
Well, exactly. Well, that's the point, because it can lead to that, right?
Yeah.
Well, I totally agree with that, Ryan. And I would say, every once in a while, I do think Francis gets a bit cranky. He is a pretty old man, and the kids these days kind of things, it does creep in sometimes. But I would say, I think as writers and editors, I think sometimes our ability to make genuine friendships out of online interactions is maybe not unique, but it's certainly, I think, more prevalent than maybe people in other lines of work, right? We discover someone's work and writing online and we get to know them, and then we do become friends in real life. But I would just say your point about structures, that it matters, right? Like how a digital space is, what its rules are, what it's, how it's set up, how it's organized. That really matters. And I think he's more than anything pointing our attention to these kind of paradoxes where that, as he put it, as the world shrinks, intolerance grows. As we gain information, we lose wisdom. And I think he's really, and another thing he points out is that we should not fear science and technology. We just have to kind of bring them under human control in the best sense of what that could mean. And he says over and over that like politics should in a way it shouldn't be the economy that drives politics, but politics driving the economy. And so,
yes.
kind of.
Yeah, he was like Carl Polanyi in that moment. I remember reading that. And great.
So I think that sort of thing that it's fine for technology to develop and for science to discover new things. And Christians should not fear that or turn into some kind of, anti-technological crankiness, but should realize the nefarious dynamics at work that we can change. It is within our power to change how these things are structured and make them more responsive to genuine human needs and real community, or maybe have them, point us more towards real relationships that start online, or just the way we interact with each other online. Those can be modified in such a way that they lend themselves more towards the real bonds and real community we should hope for. And I just think those kind of paradoxes, that we know more than ever, but we've lost wisdom, that we can meet more people than ever, but hate and intolerance seem to be spiking. He's pointing to those dynamics, and I think saying that whatever we do with technology and however we think about these digital spaces, we should be aware of them and shape them to sort of support different dynamics that are more conducive to real fraternity.
Absolutely. And maybe we can talk a bit about, going from the critique of social media, and as well as the critique of the kind of hopelessness and cynicism that says, look how broken everything is, look how terrible everything is, there's nothing to be done. And then the call for us personally to not ignore, to not be cynical, to not be hopeless. But then even beyond that, it seems like he does have fairly applicable, prescriptions for how we should think about migration and immigration, and how we should think about, the needs of the international community and nations within them. He has this other cool isomorphism where like the individual is also like a nation, and a nation should think of its responsibilities similarly. So maybe we can talk about, his kind of call, not just to the individual, but to nations and the international community, and really what he sees as necessary to shift us away from this terrible trajectory we've been on.
Yeah. I mean, one thing he gets at, which I think will please listeners of your podcast, is and this is in direct, I'm replying to your point, not changing the subject, is his critique of private property. That it is a secondary right, not an absolute first order right. And that in a way that applies to nations as well. So you can see how I'm getting to your point, which is that the kind of fortress mentality that, if we let in too many of these immigrants, like our supply of water, land, jobs, money, whatever, will be reduced. And he totally rejects that zero-sum account of of natural resources and just resources more broadly. And so just as he would say private property is not really private property, again, is a secondary right subservient to other human needs, I think he's saying the resources of a nation are also secondary and subservient to the concern with the dignity of the human person, even if that means you let in many immigrants, that you're a welcoming place for people who are leaving their homelands because of changes in climate that lead to drought and food shortages, or war-ravaged nations that make people flee for safer ground, or wherever the reason might be. And so it's that, as you're pointing out, Alexi, the kind of individual, just as the isomorphism you're pointing toward, I think it applies to nations too. And I thought that was really powerful. And it is almost unthinkable to imagine any political leader saying that actually our country's resources and wealth should be not hoarded, but actually put in service of suffering people, even if they're coming from faraway lands. And, he does say too that maybe our first priority should be to try to make sure that people's homelands are not hellscapes, right? That like the ideal situation is for people not to have to move because climate has not destroyed their crops or water, that war has not torn apart their nation. But if that is not possible, it's a pretty absolute command to accept people who need a place to live and work and, dwell in safety and peace.
Yeah. And
he
incredibly like sort of radical notion. He says, like if you really just take it seriously, I guess across the whole world, it's to say that if one person is rich and another person is poor, they're destitute. That is theft.
Yes.
It says, quote, in the first Christian centuries, a number of thinkers developed a universal vision in their reflections on the common destination of created goods. This led them to realize that if one person lacks what is necessary to live with dignity, it is because another person is detaining it. St. John Chrysostom summarizes it this way: not to share our wealth with the poor is to rob them and take away their livelihood. The riches we possess are not our own, but theirs as well.
Yes.
And that's like a sort of, I don't know who that Chrysostom fellow was, but
he's pretty dope.
Maybe
yeah. He was a good dude.
Yeah. that like not only that there's a sort of moral obligation to share, and share alike, but also that like if you have a lot of money, you didn't build that, to coin a phrase. You have appropriated the social surplus.
Yes.
You have exploited the working class.
Yeah. To borrow other phrases.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, he very clearly, if you kind of like connect the dots, he clearly is laying out like a job guarantee, a UBI, like guaranteed housing, guaranteed like it's pretty clear that the world we live in today does not at all comport with what the vision here is. And it seems pretty clear what would be required to start moving in that direction,
yes.
right?
Yes. Totally. And it's just, as you've been saying, just the radicalness of this is so striking. And frankly, I mean, as a moral leader in the world, whether you're Catholic or not, Christian or not, religious or not, this document just, I mean, I was reading it again this afternoon and it just blew me away.
Yeah.
And if we took it seriously, the ways we live together, the way they would change, it's just, it's really calling us to an entirely different way of thinking and living together.
Yes.
Yeah.
A true international solidarity, right?
Yeah. He has a lot of interesting things to say about how sort of diplomacy should be conducted, in a spirit of neighborly, a good neighbor policy, you might say. But, as we're sort of like creeping up on an hour here, I wanted to ask you about the kind of reaction to this and maybe Pope Francis more generally among what you might say conservative Catholics, especially in the United States. Though, I mean, the only ones that I know of, I suppose. Because it seems like Pope Francis is not particularly popular, and he's not particularly popular like among the sort of Catholic right, and it's because of his politics, basically. And so you have like a number of people thinking about converting to Greek Orthodoxy or something else, or just sort of like spinning their wheels, or just kind of criticizing the Pope in some way. But what is interesting to me is the idea that I've seen bandied around that you just need to create, we need like a new Pope, an anti-Pope, as it might be called. And like this theme, which seems to me to be fairly like at odds with the whole structure of Catholicism as it has existed for thousands of years, that like if he is the Pope, and you have to like listen to what he says, and maybe if you don't even agree with it, you sort of have to take it into account, and like, if you're not doing that, you're a Protestant. You are doing Protestantism. Like, you are nailing the theses on the door.
Yeah.
No, the poor are bad. They are morally abhorrent. Like, I mean, have you had this like similar? Am I totally off base here with regards to the theology or whatever?
You are not, Ryan. I mean, it's the reaction to Francis on the right, especially in the United States, which is very well organized and extremely well funded. It does create this kind of parallel reality, to be honest. And, so this document comes out, and I should say, first of all, I've been struck by the outlets who have simply not mentioned it. I think as of...
I know which character in the parable
well,
they
that's
are.
what I was going to say. The best response to some of these people was, so do tell us which character in this parable you are. So they've either passed over it in silence, or I think there's a really odious organization called the Acton Institute, which is basically Catholics for Capitalism, you might say. And they published a critique. And, what they end up doing, they did this with Laudato Si, his encyclical on climate change and caring for our common home. And they said, well, the Pope isn't a scientist. The Pope isn't an economist. And it's true that like an encyclical is not, how should I put it, not a document that invokes papal infallibility, right? So we once ran an article at Commonweal a few years ago about papal infallibility, and we titled it "It's Nothing Personal." Meaning there's a very limited. It's not like Francis became Pope and then magically everything he says is perfect and beyond dispute. But I would say the real problem with these Catholics who hate Francis, and the right-wing opposition in the United States among Catholics to Francis is a whole different subject. But I would say at the least, it's so telling that they're not willing to open their hearts and just think for a second that they might learn something, that the shepherd of the church they belong to is trying to teach them something. And they just have the answers. It's color by numbers. It's just, if you had told me 6 months ago that this document was coming, I could have told you with a high degree of specificity exactly what that article published by the Acton Institute would say. They're just not, what the exact thing Francis is calling us to, a kind of personal conversion and looking into our hearts and thinking about these matters seriously. They just refuse to engage in it. And it's, I'm not a very good Catholic. I'm not going to get up on my soapbox and, maybe I already have, sorry. but again, it's not that you have to just take blindly or receive blindly every single word this man says. But I do think there's a responsibility to at least consider what he's saying, and it's striking they don't even do that. And in some ways, I think it's even more surprising to me, not that the Acton Institute would publish a critique of it, because they really do believe in Reaganomics. And I do love in this document the way Francis takes aim at trickle-down economics and all that. Yep. It's really lovely, and it was a pleasure for me to read. But I think it's even more telling that they just didn't even talk about it. Like First Things, for example, I don't think has published anything on this document yet. I might, if I'm mistaken about that, I apologize. But it's really striking how many prominent conservative Catholics have just pretended it doesn't exist.
No, it's so ironic given the critiques that are in the document itself that are exactly being played out by the people that are ignoring it. And in fact, he hits trickle-down economics, but he also hits, neoliberalism for being a religion, for being a faith.
Yes.
The
market will solve.
Saying,
the market will solve.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Just faith that the market will take care of everything. And he just debunks that in a brilliant way. And so I think very clearly it's a kind of, look, we're all convicted by it, but especially those who think that they're adhering to the faith of Jesus Christ, our Savior, and to the Catholic faith, who maybe Pope Francis is suggesting are adhering to a different faith altogether. And that might be at the root of some of these personal, political, economic, and spiritual problems.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, he's very clear that religion can be, rather than being a living faith, can kind of curdle into an ideology. And that's what we're seeing with these people. I mean, in some ways, it's almost more accurate to say, that their faith is in some kind of like religious neoconservatism,
Yes.
And I just think it's striking too that, like, how could you look at our world and just think that everything's working fine, that the systems we have are excellent and really providing for human needs? How can you look at the pandemic and think that our society is healthy at all? And it's just, I just think it's a shame. But
or if you think that modernity is full of problems, but you think the answer is something called the quote Benedict option, and you should retreat from the world, Francis has an answer for you too, because he says, guess what? None of us are saved unless all of us are saved, and we're all bound up together.
Yes,
right?
Everything is connected, as he put it in Laudato Si.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's all the questions I had on this thing. Alexi, you got anything?
No, I just want to say that I think this has been really wonderful because, I don't know if you know this, Matt, we just did a few bonus episodes on Martin Hagelin's This Life, which, he's an atheist, and even though he uses terms like spiritual freedom, but the funny thing is, when reading this encyclical and reading about how the audience and in fact some of the people described might claim to be unbelievers, I think it's kind of a beautiful thing. And what do you think, Ryan? Some of the ideas, both in terms of like existential meaning, in terms of our very ontology and anthropology, in terms of the political needs and prescriptions, have a lot of overlap. Like the idea that that what's wrong with us and what we need are all bound up with the ways that we refuse to see each other as interconnected and to be open to loving each other and really finding in those communities, in those relationships, the kind of meaning and commitments that are denied and frustrated by capitalism, I think is kind of a beautiful juxtaposition. I don't know, Ryan, do you think so too?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, he talks a lot about how, as I was mentioning before, with he's not a materialist in a Marxist sense, and that it's all about how to enable sort of human community and human solidarity and love between peoples and groups, and in that sense, I think that it overlaps perfectly with Hagelin's vision of what is the good life, because it's not about Hagelin criticizes the focus on the afterlife, to thinking that like the whole purpose of living is to sort of like get your punch ticket into heaven and thereby have eternal life.
Yeah,
but Francis talks so much in here about like concrete existence here on planet Earth and how important that is.
Exactly.
Yeah. And
yes,
whether or not you believe in heaven and eternal life, that that's irrelevant to the question of how we live together here, and you could have some substantial agreement. And so I think that when you get down to brass tacks, how do you set up your welfare state? How do you, establish communities together? There's like quite a lot of overlap between those two perspectives, Hageland and Francis.
Yeah, so what do you think? What do you think about that?
Well, I would just say, as a reminder that, Christians, one of the core articles of our faith is that Jesus became man, took on human form, had a bodily existence, and was crucified on a cross. And it's for God to enter into our material existence, entering into human suffering and the messiness of our bodily lives. That's a part of our faith too. And maybe if we're looking to close, if you'll indulge me, one of the really lovely parts of this document is that it closes with two prayers. And the last one is called an ecumenical Christian prayer. So I apologize, for the non-Christian listeners, but and I just wanted to read the last two little parts of it. It's very quick.
Please do. Yeah.
This is the prayer that Francis closes with, or part of the prayer. He says, "Grant that we Christians may live the gospel, discovering Christ in each human being, recognizing him crucified in the sufferings of the abandoned and forgotten of our world, and risen in each brother or sister who makes a new start. Come, Holy Spirit, show us your beauty, reflected in all the peoples of the earth, so that we may discover anew that all are important and all are necessary, different faces of the one humanity that God so loves. Amen."
Oh,
Amen, brother. We can't end on a better note than that, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.